In the previous video, we talked about pacing strategies, and one of those strategies was if there's a passage type that you're not quite good at or you don't quite enjoy, it might be useful if you're running out of time to skip it, leave it until the end, come back to it later. So in order to utilize that strategy, you'd have to have some idea of the passage types, and that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Generally speaking, there are going to be 4 single passages of generally longer length, and 1 dual passage, which is composed of 2 passages that relate to one another in a particular way about a certain topic. So you might find, for example, that the dual passage gives you trouble. So maybe even if it's passage 3, maybe it's important that you leave that until the end. One thing I've forgot to mention, I think previously, but I'll emphasize it here. When you're skipping questions, right? Let's say you're skipping passage 3 because it's a dual passage, or let's say you're skipping number 3 because it's a general. Be very, very careful. Make sure you are bubbling in correctly. Make sure that you do not misbubble, that you do not bubble in the answer for number 4 into number 3, and then the answer for number 5 into number 4, because worst case scenario, you don't catch it and you get a bunch of questions wrong. Best case scenario is you have to go back and erase a bunch of answers and change them. So just be careful when you're skipping. Now, what about the breakdown of topics? This is based on the 4 released real new SATs released by the College Board. So this may change, this may be modified as they release more tests, but I think this is a pretty good overview of the kinds of passages you'll see. So here are the 5 passages and the types. The first one is typically has been a fiction passage, so it'll be something either, we'll say pre-20th century here, right? Something from like the 19th century sometimes, like a little bit older, or something contemporary, something from, last 10, 20 years. But you'll typically see that fiction passage first. Personally, if I were to skip a passage, if I were having problems with time, I would skip the fiction, because that's just one, I don't do horribly with it, but it's one that I think I struggle with more than, say, the science or the other ones, the technology and so on. Passage 2 typically has been social studies, so it could be economics, it could be about cities and demographics, it could be about different social groups, whatever it might be. It's about kind of contemporary social studies, and it's usually, at least so far, been accompanied by a figure, a graph or a chart, which is going to have questions at the end of it. The next passage, which is not necessarily passage 3, sometimes it is a science passage. So something about biology, earth science, could be physics, could be chemistry. And again, usually this one has a figure. You're going to have your social studies, your social science one have a figure or a chart, and then you're going to have your hard science one have a figure or a chart. This next one, it was hard for me to come up with a good categorization for it, because there was some about technology, but there was a little bit of a grab bag, a little bit of mixture of science as well. But you can kind of call it another science passage, though I found it seems to be focusing on current technology and current technological innovations. For example, the internet, social media. So it's a bit more of a contemporary piece, perhaps a bit more relatable, and sometimes might have a figure, but depends on if the other science passage has a figure. The next passage, and again, not necessarily the last passage, but definitely one you'll see, is the Great Global Conversation passages. Another way of putting this, it's essentially history, either of the United States or of the world in general, and it's the great global conversation about politics, about feminism, about the American founding, right? The Declaration of Independence, all the stuff that went into that, race, other issues like that. So it's something you might read in a social studies class, for example. These passages sometimes are a little bit old, from the 18th century or the 19th century. Sometimes they're a bit more contemporary. You don't necessarily need to know background knowledge for them, because anything that they ask a question about is something you can get evidence from in the passage. But having some background can at least give you the context and can help you understand what's going on with them sometimes. The dual passage really could be any of these, with the exception of the fiction passage. You're never going to have I should say never, but most likely are never going to have a dual fiction passage. And usually it's going to be one of these, like the current technology one or the Great Global Conversation. It really depends. Subject matter preparation. I alluded to this a little bit previously when we talked about the Great Global Conversation passage. As I've talked about, you don't need to know any outside knowledge to answer these questions. In fact, having outside knowledge can actually hurt you on certain questions, because it's all about what's in the text. Now, that said, having some background in the subject matter, for example, in the history passages or even in the science passages, can help you orient yourself to the passage and understand what's going on a little bit easier than someone who may have no idea what's going on at all. So what's the best way to prepare for this? Now, we'll talk more about this later in the video, the last video, what to do next. But the most important thing you can do is read nonfiction, because as you can see here, 4 out of the 5 passages are nonfiction, right? We're not talking about a novel or a story in these 4 passages. Passage 1 is going to be your fiction passage, but the other 4 are nonfiction. And the challenge is, very often in your English class in high school, you're going to read novels, maybe plays, poems, short stories, right? But this is all essentially fiction. It's not history or sociology or science or philosophy. And the challenge is, sure, you might be used to reading this stuff and you might have skills to read and analyze these works, but these nonfiction works, which you may not read often, I don't know, maybe in your social studies class you might read something like this, or maybe your science, maybe in certain English classes you might look at, like a rhetoric class, you might look at some stuff nonfiction. But generally speaking, through your high school and really academic career, you're not going to focus as much on nonfiction. And this is where the gap, the weaknesses come in for a lot of students. So we'll talk about this later, but what you're going to want to read is quality nonfiction. It doesn't have to be books. It could be quality magazine articles, quality newspaper articles, quality long form pieces, whatever it is that you're interested in reading. That can help you build that knowledge base that can assist you with parsing and understanding some of these passages.